importantly, and I can do a pronunciation test, is the Declaration of the Ombudsman, which did I do a good job on the pronunciation there? These folks are here to help us keep a professional atmosphere, and if you feel that is not going on in this working group or in any working group you attend, I encourage you to please bring those issues to your chairs, and if that's not appropriate, this team can also help with that. All right, so Administrivia. Blue sheets, Mark started those around. We have some people coming in now. Please make sure you sign them, because with the attendance we have today, your vote will count. Scribes, we have a scribe. Thank you, Ian Sweat. We have a Jabber relay. Thank you, Barbara Stark. And then we're going to move on to the agenda and any bashing anyone may want to do. That was for Monday session, and this is for Tuesday session. Fundamentally, we're going to just work through our active drafts, find what work we have in front of the working group. I hope we can move a couple of these items to last call. And then after that, we have one item in time permitting regarding HTTP2 and compression. First, before we move on to the active drafts, we can take a moment to recognize the things that have changed in the set of active drafts since last we met. So we've adopted VCP 56 BIS, which you won't find in Data Tracker yet because we actually finished that adoption while Data Tracker was closed. We've been all too busy to actually do the paperwork this week, but we're going to treat that as active. And Origin Frame has been sent to the IESG, and they've begun their IETF last call on that topic. The first message from our area director on that one has appeared on the mailing list this morning. So that's good. And I believe something else. Well, it'll come to me. Was early hints. Okay. So that's good. 1 in, 2 out. That's kind of the right direction of actually getting us towards a reasonable set of documents to take on. Okay. So with that being said, the first thing. Oh, would anyone like to bash the agenda? It's always a really brilliant moment in the IETF when someone steps up to the microphone and says, "Throw that all out. This is what I want to talk about." All right. With that being said, we're going to start with what's side number 1 there? Expect CT. So, Mark, you've been talking more with Emily on this. Do you want to? Emily wasn't available to present here in Singapore, but she did provide us sort of a readout on where that is. So we'd like to maybe Mark can go through the summary that Emily sent, and then we'll sort of open the mic for any comments people have on this work. The relevance of this work, given the timelines involved and the changes in the CA community.
So this is the summary that Emily sent us. I won't read it to you. I don't think I have too much to add, really. I think that the state we're in with Expect CT is we're gathering just a little bit of implementation experience before we push it forward. Emily said that she thought that it would be best to park the document for a while and allow folks to make sure that it made sense as specified. And I think we're near the end of that phase, so we're probably going to go to work with RESTful fairly soon. But I'd like to hear her request that rather than just impose it upon her. Any comments on Expect CT? Moving on.
Without much to add, I do have maybe one comment. We anticipate changes in 2018 amongst, Chrome's other requirements, right? What they feel the relevance of this header, the lifetime of this header will be, and whether or not it's worth deploying, or how long we'll have to, excuse me, how long we'll have to live with it thereafter. Just like a little discussion around that before we start. So we actually jumped ahead because Emily's comments were on the chair slides, and so I just jumped right into them because they were next. But the agenda actually had us talking about early data in HTTP, which I think we should do. So Martin, if you want to say a few words of where we are and where we would, like to be.
Yes, Martin Thompson. I think this is done. We've had a great lot of input from the working group. It's rare to see this sort of document have input from, I guess, 10 people at least in a very short amount of time. And we've got now, I think, 3 implementations that I'm aware of. and intent to implement by a couple more. So all signs are that it works, and we're about to see TLS 1.3 go out. So this is a timely time to turn the crank and spit out some sausage.
Here, Pascola. So I read this in the plain over. I have a few minor comments that I think aren't quite right, but I think it's basically ready, and I think if you're working with Pascal, I can make them there.
Tommy Polly Apple. Yeah, I think the document looks good. Just having read through it, just one thing that's conspicuously like not mentioned is other things that do early data that other than TLS 1.3, like you could do this over just TFO. Do we want even just a mention of that to acknowledge that that exists in there? It just seemed a little bit conspicuous. I mean, everyone should be doing TLS, but
so I think that the primary focus of this is on the attacks against the TLS early data. So TFO does send things earlier, but that doesn't really change the security posture at all. So I don't think it's particularly relevant.
okay, yeah, that's fine. In case other people reading this have the same thought, though, it could be interesting just to mention that there are other protocols and that they do not have this property. If you don't believe they have a security plan.
So when we adopted this document, we actually set a timeline saying we would like to open the last call during the Singapore meeting. So here in the Singapore meeting, so I think we'll open the last call. We'll keep that open on the list for a couple weeks, kind of thing. See if any more ideas trickle in. But with that being said, I mean, I think this is been a great experience. We got in a relatively short, tight document. I got input from a wide variety of people. We met our timelines on it, and we're going to get it off of the docket. So feel good about that. Any other thoughts on early data 425? We're okay with 425 as the response code. No one still has bad feelings about that. All right. With that being said, next on the docket is random access and live content, which I think we're going to try and do remotely. Craig, we don't have remote presentations before, so if Craig just tries to speak, we can, it's the please speak button. We can hit the red button and let him speak. We have a backup in the room for Craig if it doesn't work, but here we go.
Can you hear me?
We can. Good morning.
Good morning. It's very dark for morning here. Okay, so this is just supposed to be an update on where we are with random access and live resources. The request at the last meeting was to basically ensure that some intermediaries were able to operate well with this. So I guess you're advancing slides though, right? I can't advance slides from here, I don't think.
Yep, just give us a clue.
Okay, go ahead. So this is a brief recap of what we had. Basically, the idea here, if you recall, was to use a very large number as a range end to basically indicate an indeterminate length appending resource. If the server returns to you your large number, you can assume that they support this functionality. And then if you flip to the next slide, usually a server that doesn't support this functionality should basically give you the end of the content instead of your very large number. Having some breakup here. Okay, so anyway, we've prototyped this. If we go forward to the next slide. I don't know, do we do questions along the way if anybody has any questions, or at the end?
I think given that you're remote, we'll save them for the end. It'll be easy.
I'm cool either way. So, Okay, so here's some pointers to, we have a live server people can try. Basically, it's feeding a NASA TV stream that supports this live appending functionality, so you can go and actually try grabbing some of the data or whatever, and as well as a couple of reverse proxies we've set up, and source code. So if you want to go to the next one. Here's an example session with that server. This, basically looks as you'd hope. It should look exactly like what was, prototyped and what's in the RFC. We return, this is using plain old curl. So plain old curl works with these streams just great. It'll just continue to download the content as it goes. If we, so this is the request response. If you flip to the next slide, we can see the server and the client kind of doing their thing. Here, the hash marks represent data being transmitted, and the dots are pauses on the server. And you can kind of see, here's curl showing its bitrate outputs, and you kind of see it vacillating in bitrate as it sporadically gets live data past the live point. And that long set of hash marks there at the top, that would be like your random access data. Like if you're doing video, that could be your keyframe or whatever it is you need to kind of bootstrap yourself. Anyway, and this would just keep running basically forever. If you were to go grab this, you would just have this growing file on your system that you could play in VLC or something like that. In this case, because this is the NASA TV stream is basically one continuous transport stream. So, okay, so go to the next slide. So this is our small little summary. We have details on the following slides if we want to go into them, showing showing our basic results. The interesting thing is how well kind of Squid and Varnish actually worked. I wasn't really expecting them to. I was expecting them to work the same way that Varnish works in default mode, which is basically, if you do a request, it's going to make this. It's just going to give you a static chunk of the content representing where that is at that particular point in time. But the important thing is it's coherent. Byte X equals of the origin data equals byte X of what you download. So there's no coherency problems or anything there that we've seen. And still working on Cloudflare testing. So I don't know. Real quick, I guess we can go through what those requests look like. It's kind of the same thing if you go forward a slide, or we can skip this too if time's critical.
We have time if you think it's useful.
Yeah, we'll go through it quick. If you can forward the next slide. Okay. So this is, it's basically the same sort of thing, hitting the reverse proxy with a curl command. This is Varnish, this is out of the box Varnish, as I'd call it. And you can see here that we have our origin server, which is a live server, and then Varnish in front of it, and it's basically giving us back this fixed number as the range end down below, and also it's not giving us a star to represent intermediate content. So a client who's implemented against the RFC would basically operate on this guy as if he's static content and say, okay, this, I can't do any fun stuff with aggregating content with this server. But the intermediary, like I say, there aren't any problems with the, Varnish doesn't break. The data that's cached is byte-wise correct, that sort of thing. So we can flip ahead to the next one. So this is Varnish reverse proxy configured with this range support. So these are basically config file changes. And this worked remarkably well. Although what I'm trying to do is to resist looking into optimizing the caching. As interesting as that would be, really, we were just trying to check to make sure that, again, Varnish doesn't break and we aren't returning bad data. And in that sense, everything was cool. It basically, it acted as a proxy, and it looked exactly like the like we were operating on the origin server. So that was a nice surprise, actually. So we can go to the next slide here. This is an example of what that looked like. It's similar to the live range. You can see here at the beginning, you can see the bit rate goes from being fairly high because we're getting random access content, and then it peters out as we start to go into the live content, and that stabilizes more towards the bit rate of the NASA TV upstream. The only side effect of this seems to be, and like I say, I hadn't gotten too much into it, and it may have to do with the way that I've configured it. But it seems like that Varnish was just trying to get, even after I canceled my session, it was just continuing to try to download live data like it was going to do it indefinitely. I didn't wait. I should have let it run a little longer, but Darshak's paying for the bandwidth, so I didn't want to break his bank account by running it for like a day or something. But anyway, that's what that looks like for Varnish with range support. So we can go ahead to the next slide. Squid reverse proxy actually operated just like the Varnish plus range support. It actually was telegraphing through the indefinite range requests. Go ahead and flip to the next one. And these slides just aren't big enough. Okay, same story basically here. We accessed a whole bunch of random access content, and the bit rate peters off as it was hitting the live content. And Squid's a little bit better in the sense that once the curl closes its session, the Squid closes its connection with the origin server and stops buffering. So it was really promising. So all in all, so that's basically it. I guess there's just comments and questions.
So we'll open the mic line.
Like I say, I would. One thing I'd anticipate is again, we weren't checking these to make sure that they were being very optimal about how they're buffering data, or that we aren't completely blowing their, the proxy caches, storage or anything like that. This is just making sure we aren't destroying them and we're getting good data. Okay.
Thanks. Before we take comments from the floor, I will just say that the chairs. This is currently slated as experimental, and the chair's sort of intention is to open last call with this meeting and to start taking those comments. So.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, as an experimental draft, I think this is plenty of testing. I would say that maybe we could say the experiment has worked, and we might want to go propose standard on this, even if other people are amenable to that. This is good work. Thanks for doing this all, Craig. I'm a little nervous about the Varnish thing, but I think that's just something that those guys will have to have a look at and maybe make a few tweaks so that they don't open themselves up to denial of service. But maybe it's not a real problem, and maybe they'll keep trying for a little while and give up eventually. But it'd be interesting to know what's going on there. But ultimately, the choice to deploy something like this with something like varnish is something that a server is going to make. So they'll be wanting to test that the code works. And if we have an RFC describing how this works, then they can test that too. So I'm not particularly concerned about the few little oddities in the behavior there. Things didn't break. The bytes didn't get truncated in weird ways or mashed against. I can imagine all sorts of failure modes for this, but this seems fine.
And the regarding varnish too, it's important that that wasn't the out-of-the-box configuration that had the issues. It was special changes that were intended to do range support, and there were lots of caveats on that description of that functionality in terms of it not doing coalescing and things like that. And yeah, I really hope that what happens is people will go forward and start doing those things, start doing coalescing and supporting sub ranges on cache content and that sort of thing. Okay, sorry.
Vishak Thakur, Cable Labs. So I think, yeah, our hope was to also finish the Cloudflare testing, but hopefully we'll probably get some results from that also, because that's kind of the more interesting or the more common use case that may happen in kind of a CDN kind of environment. We'll probably publish those results on the mailing list, but I'm hoping that there should be enough to kind of at least issue a last call.
We can certainly keep the last call open until that completes.
And I was thinking, yeah, I agree with Patrick. Thank you very much for doing this work. This is absolutely what we asked you to do and more, and that's great. I think going to last call now is probably appropriate, and that sends a signal that we're serious about this. And maybe I was just thinking as well, keep the last call open for a bit longer to give different server vendors and so forth a chance to take a serious look at it.
So Mark, what about the question of experimental versus PS? I don't remember a discussion about the intended status of this.
We spoke about it experimental. I think we need to go away, maybe have a bit of a chat, but I'm not necessarily against standard.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have discussed the issue before, so we should bring up the thread and see how we arrived where we arrived.
Yeah, because there's this pattern in the organization where things that people want to propose like this, they've tested them, they intend to deploy them, and they say experimental just to avoid the level of review that people have lower expectations from an experimental draft, so that the level of review isn't quite as thorough. And I think in this case, the document is of a high enough quality, and the testing that we're seeing, particularly if we can get a little bit more information in a reasonable period, I think it would be perfectly fine to just go propose standard. After all, it is just a proposed standard.
Yeah, I'm less concerned about the status of the document. I think that's probably true, but like Patrick says, let's go and see how we got where we are. And I particularly want to make sure that we get folks like Apache and other CDNs and the Varnish team themselves, just to have a look at this and make sure they're comfortable with it.
Right. I think with proposed standard, the question of other intent to implement becomes a stronger question, and we might want to resurvey.
Ted Hardy, a clarifying question about the aspect of this that deals with the representation where you have sort of the deletion at the beginning, right? So there's a description in section 3.2 of how this works when you have a resource where there's sort of a time window. You can go back in time a certain distance, but not all the way back. And so it presents this mechanism of saying, hey, this is live, and there's a certain buffer in the beginning that moves over time. And I'm trying to figure out what that would look like when we're talking about what I put in the cache for the resource. When I'm saying, I was told that it's available from this byte range to an indeterminate length. I chose something later than that byte range as a first. How do I know the last possible moment I can go and backfill? And the answer to that may mean you don't, right? In this particular case, wherever you start from, unless you start a new request and get a fresh response, you have to assume that putting it into your local cache from that point on, you're not going to be able to go and backfill. But if that's going to be the case, the draft might want to say that out loud. just because otherwise, if you choose to pick someplace that's not at the beginning of the range that you're supplied, in order to get closer to the current place, you now know you can't go backward in time anymore, even if the server could have done it at the moment you started. So I'm trying to figure out kind of concretely what I would put in a PR to suggest the language for that, and it's not really coming to me, but I think it might be useful kind of working out what those semantics are and having some language in the draft that just says, hey, once you picked a range, if you want to go backward in time from the range, you've got to start over to figure out what that new range looks like.
So, Darshark, Craig, if you want to address that as author.
Darshark Labs. So, if I understand your question correctly, what you're saying is that I initially found out that this is the starting range, and then at some point of time later on, I may want to make a request for that range, and it may not be available. Is that kind of the?
So if you look at the way the shift buffer range is here, it like gives you a content range that starts here and goes to there, and then gives you the indeterminate.
Yep.
If I don't use,
Can you get close to the mic, please?
Sorry, I'm looking at section 3.2 at the example that's at the top of page 7, or I guess at the top of page 8, just below. And what I'm showing him is that the way the content range is displayed, you have a range followed by the indeterminacy marker. And if you don't go to the beginning of the range to start, my belief is that you don't necessarily always have access to that same beginning of the range, because the description says this is probably a sliding window.
So in that case, like what is supposed to happen just based on the range request semantics is, if the server is able to satisfy even a part of that range, it will send a 206 with the range that it sends back. If the server cannot satisfy anything, it's supposed to send, I think, a 416 range not satisfiable. Or I think whatever the range not satisfiable code is, and send that.
Okay, so you're saying instead of actually adding text to the draft, you just use the existing semantics of range not satisfied. And even though this was the original response, you just have to, at that point as a client, figure out, I give up now. That's no longer satisfiable. Okay, that works for me.
Yeah, that's correct. As long as there's some overlap. So the way to think about it, as long as there's some overlap, you should be getting a partial content. But the included is in the response is the area that's overlapped, right, in the content range.
Yeah. So Martin Thompson, I think we're talking about things that are actually kind of unlikely in practice. The number of resources that have bits of them that go missing over time is relatively few, and the number of people actually doing things like coalescing of byte ranges and things like that are also relatively few. It's good to have it out in practice, but I think we have all the existing mechanics in 7235, I think it is, that covers most of this stuff. 34, I forget. That's a number. The range covers all of it. 33, yeah. And so, yeah, 416 covers basically everything you need to know.
And Ted's question for me kind of brings up another aspect of this, in that I think we're getting comfortable with the safety of this. Another aspect is cache friendliness, and in my experience, caches and range handling are all over the map. And so I'd also like a little feedback from cache implementers as to, if they need any more explicit signal or anything else to make this more efficient for them. But that can be part of last call feedback, I think.
But I was actually comforted that the answer was it's defined by 7230 something, right? Instead of a new semantic for this, which is, I think a really good answer. Okay, seeing no other questions, what we'll do is we'll open the last call, then maybe in the working group, and maybe work through these last few nickels. Next on our agenda for this morning was supposed to be expect CT, but we've already talked to that. So we'll move on to header common structure, which has seen a fair amount of discussion since we last met, along with a proposal from Mark called structured headers, which may be a way forward on some of those issues. So he'll talk to that.
So yeah, we adopted JFV a long time ago from Julian, which described how to use a JSON serialization of the JSON data model in HTTP headers. After a lot of discussion, there was some feeling that that wasn't the appropriate way to go, and Paul Henning-Kamp came up with the header common structure, which was his sketch of the beginning of what he wanted that, that sort of thing to look like. And that got enough consensus where we decided to adopt that and in favor of JFE. And then it sat there for a while. Paul had some other stuff that he had to do. And, I personally felt like we needed to move forward on this. I had some ideas that I wrote down as structured headers for HTTP, which you see here. And then when I had it sketched out to the level that I was comfortable with, I went to Paul Henning and said, what do you think? Is this, the next step forward? He agreed to come on and co-author with me, and we've been refining this in the background, and we announced at a working group where we've got a good amount of feedback. So talking to Patrick, I think the question is, do we just make this version 02 of the structured header draft? Do we want to actually swap it out or whatever? I think that's just mechanics. But I think the question to ask here is, putting aside all of the discussion around the minute details of how we represent numbers, for example, which could easily consume this session and into next week, is this the general direction that we think we want to go in? And that's the feedback and the discussion that I think is probably appropriate at this point.
Kazuho, I very much like this draft in the sense that it tries to clarify the best practices instead of trying to invent new things. So in that way, I think we should adopt this draft.
Thank you. And to be clear, it is still very rough. The algorithms in particular are just kind of thrown up there, and maybe they stick, maybe they don't. But we wanted to get the conversation going. Kazuho. Since I am an author on this, I'm not acting as a chair in this. Our chair tells us that we have a extremely time-bounded amount of time for discussion.
I did want to, as chair, open the floor for comments on the draft in particular. We do have enough time this morning, and it's if anyone has strong opinions on any of these matters, it's not a bad moment to hear it, but this will be time-bounded. I don't see people running to the microphone, so I'm not all that worried about how big an integer ought to be. But if you have feelings, I'm interested in maybe a census of the room, just a show of hands, of who has read the potential subsequent draft here, structured headers, and wants to make a comparison to the previous effort and see if that's the direction they want to go in. Because we saw a couple nods, but I'm not sure we really have enough people participating to make an informed judgment. So can I have a show of hands of who's sort of read both of these drafts? That's like 6, maybe. Okay. Yeah, we may need more comments from the list here.
Yeah, Martin Thompson. To be fair, there's a lot more people who aren't here who have read the drafts, because a lot of the discussion on the list is from folks who are not in this room, apart from Kazuo here, who's been involved in deciding how long a number should be.
Of course, I'm just trying to figure out how to weigh the input we're getting today versus that other input.
Yeah. Personally, I think this is much more promising than what was written in the other draft. But I think it probably needs a good deal of work, particularly in the areas of things like the numbers, so that we can, I guess, narrow it down to the set of things that we're comfortable with. And I think there's a little bit of work left to do there. That said, that work could happen in the working group. I would rather see this be adopted as a replacement for the structured headers, the other Paul Henning's draft, rather than just leave this hanging, because we then have this hanging common structure thing that just I don't think it's particularly useful at the moment. I mean, that we had grand aspirations for it, and that's great, but it didn't really eventuate, and we really started to discover that all those places where it wasn't really going to work for us. This is maybe closer.
Right. So that's clearly one of Mark's motivations here. Is we had many chair discussions about how to move this work forward, and it's just too big and parts of it of too little value. The existing things of what we've adopted. And the hope here is that this is more focused on something that's meaningful and a solvable problem. Okay. With that being said, unless anyone has any further comments on that.
My only comment is I'm really happy with the level of engagement on the list about the draft. That's what's giving me hope here. That would need to continue, and it would need to broaden beyond just number formats.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, I would caution against things like bike sheds being used as signal here. So we'll see how this works out. I have hopes as well, but you put a red rag in front of a bull, and now you're celebrating the fact that it charged you. So don't overstate.
Bull's not dead, yay.
So, and I hate to put people on the spot, but Julian, you have a ton of expertise in this, and I know you're sitting there listening to us from the other side of the planet. And I'm wondering if this would be a good time for you to chime in. If you'd like to, we're happy to hit the red button. In the meantime, Mike Line.
Piotr Sikora, Google. I apologize because I didn't follow up the discussion on the mailing list, but is there any reason for restrictions on the length of various types?
That's one of the discussions I think we need to have. There was certainly, from what I read on the list, significant sentiment against having lengths on individual fields or limits on individual fields.
Yeah,
We'll have to talk through that.
Yeah, I think we should remove those because it would break a lot of existing deployments.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part.
I think like the existing limits would break a lot of existing deployments when people send very large headers.
So Martin Thompson, I think the comment here is that if we were to retroactively apply these constraints to existing headers, we would find ourselves in some sort of pain. But I don't think that's the intention of the draft. The intention of the draft is to say, if you're going to define a new header field, maybe you want to use these recipes. It doesn't say that you have to use these recipes either. It just gives you a this is good practice. If you diverge from that good practice, be certain that you really want it.
It would be wonderful if we could clean up the mess that is header parsing for all of HTTP, but that is a much larger task that we don't feel we're capable of doing right now. So this is really just to stop the pain, at least for newer headers.
So on Jabber from Julian, he says, I think this goes into the right discussion. Would be good to decide on adoption soon. Haven't read it in depth yet.
Thank you. And we have Yoav remotely.
Hi. So I haven't gotten into the details of the draft, but what I want to emphasize, and something I just recently realized, that kind of structure would enable us to provide significantly better HBAC compression for parameter names and would relieve pressure from giving new drafts very short parameter names in order to save bytes.
So you're saying that we could take advantage of structured headers to in a newer version of header compression?
Yes, I'm saying that once we have structured headers, we could have HBAC2, which adds parameter names, static parameter names, into the static value index.
Thanks, Yoav. Okay, so I will come up with a plan for how we move forward, just from a procedural point of view. I'll put that out to the list for comment. Next on our docket this morning, Cache Digest for HV2, and Kazuo's got a presentation while he comes up. This is one that's been with us for a while, and I hope we seem to be nearing a finish line. Now we've made some changes, so hopefully this will be enough to get us sort of over the end point.
So hi, I'm Kazuho. So could you next slide? Thank you. So we are now in Alaska, and we've seen a new proposal from Yoav, thanks to Yoav, and that's this pull request. And it essentially has two changes. So next, please. First is the sending cache digest settings parameter. So this one is pretty simple. It's a way for the client to say that, hey, I'm going to send a cache digest. So could the server please wait, deciding what to push until you see my cache digest? And the client's strategy would be to send a cache digest frame for every request that goes to a new origin. And or if it doesn't want to send a cache digest, they need to send an empty cache digest frame with reset flag indicating that I'm not going to give you any indication on what I have. So it's a pretty simple thing. And I think that I hope that we can merge this. And so could you next slide, please? And the next one is more debatable, and it tries to change the digest algorithm from GON coded sets that we use now to Kaku filters. And the motivation behind that is to maintain a persistent structure on the client side and send it when it's necessary, rather than iterating through the cache to build a digest when sending a cache digest frame. And so on the browser side, you would essentially have a filter that or hash table that implements an event handler for two events. And one is a insertion event when a browser cache, a new object is added to the browser cache, it has an insert event. And when an entry gets evicted, it would have an eviction event. So the intent is to create a hash that could be sent to the server and also a hash that receives only those two events. And the other aspect of the change is that since there would be only the insertion and the eviction event, you cannot determine whether if a entry within a Kaku filter is fresh or stale. Next, please. So thanks to Europe, we now have some preliminary numbers regarding the size of the Kaku filter digest. Please note that this is still preliminary, and we might have some optimization possibilities that further trim down the size. And as you can see, the size of storing 3,000 digests with a false positive probability of 1 out of 256 is about, 6 kilobytes or 5 kilobytes at minimum. And for comparison, GCS was just below 4 kilobytes in this same data set. Next, please. And the other issue that we need to discuss is about losing the distinction between fresh digest and stale digest. And the data is very small and it's old, but we can assume that there'll be something like twice as much as stale digest compared to fresh digest. So losing the distinction would mean that the browsers would be forced to send about 3 times large cache digest. And the other issue is that we don't even know how we should handle stale digest, because in HTTP2 we haven't specified how to push 3 or 4 responses. Next, please. And on the server side, Kaku filters has a good characteristic in the sense that you don't need to decode the digest before using it. Well, this is, of course, if the digest is sent uncompressed, but it's a good thing. And the cons is that the URL and E tag needs to be, the two properties are needed to check if a asset needs to be pushed or not. And that could have implications on certain caches, because instead of just looking at the URL, you need to actually fetch the object and check the E tag to see if you should push the object. Next, please. So that's the summary of our status. And so I think that we have 3 options now. One is to replace GCS with Kaku filters. And if we are interested in taking that route, I think that we should at least wait for a working implementation. And the second choice is define both algorithms, or possibly just reserve a field that can be used to indicate which algorithm is being used. And the third option is to stick to using GCS. And even if we decide to stick to using GCS, it wouldn't be in for the Kaku filters approach, because personally I believe that it will be possible to adjust the approach so that you could generate a GCS from something like Kaku filter structure. And we also need to discuss about the time frame as well, I think, because we are already 2 years since adopting this draft. Thank you.
Sebastian Decker's no affiliation. I would like to know if there's any intention to implement sort of signaling between the client and server when a cache object is inserted or purged or evicted.
Well, so a browser can resend a cache digest if it sees changes to the cache. But as long as the only changes it receives for the origin that the browser is connected to is from that connection, then there's no need to signal changes, because a server can assume that what it has pushed is now stored in the cache.
It's my understanding that you can do multiple origins within the same cache digest, though.
Yes, and every cache digest frame has a origin field, so it will be possible to do that.
Mike Bishop, Akamai, I think the replacement with cuckoo filters makes a lot more sense, because you can just have one object and keep it up to date, rather than having to crawl through your cache to generate it, or even to crawl the table at processing time. I really don't like the idea of having two different algorithms that clients now have to signal which one they support, which means servers have to support both, or they risk having mismatch with clients. I don't think there's enough win from one over the other, at least in my understanding, to support both. But on the whole, I think this is useful work, and I think we do need to figure out how to push 304s.
Mark Nottingham. I'm an author on this draft, so I'm not that guy who sits up there. Yov, could you actually, you're wearing your Chrome hats, at least partially, for this interaction. Is that correct?
To some extent, yes. So both my Chrome hat as well as my Akamai hat.
Okay. From my perspective personally, the problem that we've had in this draft, for its, as Kazuho points out, its long lifetime, is that we had trouble getting clients interested, especially browsers interested in implementing this. So if there's a good chance of getting browser implementation, or at least some good experimentation by going with cuckoo filters, then that makes me think maybe that's a good idea. And if the working group decides to do that, I'm happy to take my name off the draft and have Yoav go in as an author, because I think obviously he's going to be generating a fair amount of text in the draft. And what I like about that is that that's we have someone at least partially representing a browser and someone representing the server side working together, because this is a collaboration between the two.
Go ahead, Sebastian.
Sebastian speaking. I just want to say that I agree with that, and also that I did a experimental prototype about a year ago using the GCS, but purely as a service worker, not integrated into the browser. And the results of that, for my experiments at least, were very positive in terms of performance. Although I do think that I sort of misunderstood the intent, where I did not intend it to replace the thinking time of the browser on the opening of the connection, but I used it to sort of replace Webpack, bundling assets and drastically reducing the reload time of a front-end application, basically. So I think there are experiments that prove that this is very meaningful work. But yeah, that's all.
So we've had a couple of comments about how this has been with us a while. And I would also note it's experimental, so we don't have to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. So I would encourage you to have the courage of your convictions and make a decision under that experimental banner. We obviously need a new last call, right, for that going forward. But do you have thoughts on what you would like to do of these three options?
Well, I think the best option would be to wait for working implementation because
of Cuckoo. But so of the three you have down here,
A, I'd say, well, wait and decide.
but you're hopeful you can go with A based upon that experience.
Well, A or C, I'd say. I mean, because it might be possible to adjust the Cuckoo filter implementation to use GCS and see how it goes.
Just thinking out loud, I haven't heard of any interest of anyone generating the frame with GCS, although you seems to be using the header. Would it make sense to publish the document we have without the frame and just describing a way to do it with headers and service workers? Maybe it's experimental, and then see how Cuckoo filters goes for the more integrated browser integrated flow. You're still live.
I think that's a good option. Yeah.
Did you want to say anything else?
I think replacing GCS with Cuckoo filters is worthwhile for the reasons you mentioned. Because I don't see the GCS approach being adopted, and I do see the Cuckoo filters approach being adopted. I'm not sure what would releasing GCS as a header would give us over the current experiments. But as long as it's done in a way that will avoid confusion around cache digests, I'm fine with it.
Thanks, Joe.
Sebastian, I don't have any particular opinions regarding GCS versus Cuckoo filters. I do have a experiment that I've been working on at the hackathon, and I'll hope to conclude that soon to compare the two, if that helps at all.
I think that'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no further comments, I think we'll have to take it to the list too and wait for the authors to figure out how they want to update the document. Thank you. I'll make one last call for blue sheets. Blue sheets. There's one still out there somewhere. Mr. Barnes, I'm looking at you. And got one up here if you need it as well. Okay, after Cache Digest, we have client hints. So it's on the big board up there. Maybe Mark would want to talk to this. So we got this update from Ilya, who is the author of the client hint specification, and he could not be here with us today.
So client hints is still progressing. I think Ilya is still working on it in a couple of different directions. This is another document we've been working on for a while, and we've been trying to get right. Most of the discussion recently has been around Accept CH Lifetime and Accept CH to figure out how the mechanism for advertising this works. And especially around privacy considerations, there have been some concerns brought and hopefully dealt with. If you're not familiar with this, I'd encourage you to look at the most recent draft and the discussion. Most of that has been happening on GitHub. I think that we've probably got another cycle or so of work to do on this document before it's really ready to go. So maybe early-ish next year is, I think, what we're looking at for the group last call. And also, depending on the adoption of variants, right now this document refers to key. I think Ilya has said that if we adopt variants, he'll swap that out to refer to variants.
I'm encouraged that the movement on this document is now around fundamental issues of negotiating client hints and its lifetime and that kind of thing, and is not amongst the details of the set of hints that are provided back and forth, because that would just be a living document that would never converge. And we seem to have exhausted most of those issues and are onto the fundamental ones. So I think there is actually hope now that we'll get this out, and maybe variants will be the not the blocker, but the contemporaneous document that needs to happen to make it go forward. Ilya's not with us, but are there any other thoughts anyone has on the client hints work?
So Martin Thompson, there was a thread on the list about a geolocation header that hoped to use this mechanism. I didn't respond to that thread, but I have opinions. Where are we going with this long term? Because the current structure of the document is pretty well suited to the sort of things that it describes, the new header fields that it includes. But once it gets outside that comfort zone, it may not work very well unless we bring in some more examples. Unfortunately, I think geolocation would be an awesome example to test this out and a terrible thing to add. So I don't know where we want to go on that, but I agree that working through the fundamentals here is where we're at, and it's not quite there, but I can sort of see an end in sight. So it's not. The other thought that I had was, is this experimental? Is that the aim?
Yes.
Okay. That makes me a little bit more comfortable about some of this stuff. The security and privacy considerations are considerably better than they were before, which is probably the main reason why you would sort of hold the publication of something like this. But the rest of it, whether it's fit for purpose, I think we have a lower bar if it's experimental.
I do think we've gotten into the habit a little bit of misusing the experimental state for something we're not quite sure about, but let's lump it out there and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is the experiment?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm sort of wondering whether the experiment is, does anyone actually want to implement this other than the author of the document? That may be the question that we can ask about proposed standard.
I don't know if that
helps.
helps.
Is the experiment, can we publish it and then everybody else will feel they have to implement it?
Yoav.
Yes. Just regarding Martin's comment about geolocation headers, and I think privacy in general, I think we will need at some point to distinguish capabilities that are available for active content versus passive content. And we already started to address that in the recent accept CH lifetime draft, as well as Ilya has a proposal to add something to feature policy that will enable exposing of the client hints info to select third parties rather than providing providing access to that info to all third parties. Because on the one hand, providing that information to third parties is a very important use case, and on the other hand, it's very easy to abuse it. So this is work in progress, and I think that capabilities like geolocation, even though I'm not necessarily convinced about that particular use case, I think we should address something like that. And be able to guarantee privacy restrictions around it.
I don't know what guarantee privacy restrictions means. I mean, these mechanisms obviously have a negative impact on user privacy. I mean, it's not like every bit you leak out of the browser without causing the server to ask for it specifically is a privacy issue, and we've seen that. And so I mean, we've seen a number of cases where servers interrogate stuff from the browser they have no actual intention of using, and they use it for fingerprinting purposes. WebRTC is the classic example here. And the only reason we know that's being misused is because you can observe the servers interrogating for it and then just discard and then just exfiltrate the data. And so to put yourself in a position where where basically the server says is please send me a pile of stuff that is sensitive fingerprinting data that I might happen to use or might not use to condition my site, and you cannot tell what I'm doing, essentially removes the ability of researchers like Engelhardt and Narayanan to find out when this is being misused. So I guess I'm not like, you know, we should be like using the ANA registry to stop people from doing things that are shitty, because that like never works. But I don't understand what the like, what is the experiment? This seems to me to be putting the working group stamp on this practice, and I don't understand what the experiment is that is being experimented with, other than like, will the privacy people like freak out?
So when we adopted the document, I think there was pushback not on this aspect, but just around general implementer interest. And we adopted it as experimental, as we have with other documents in the past, because we weren't sure if it was going to really get broad adoption. I think that's probably not a good use of the experimental state. Separate from that, the privacy and security concerns, we've had a fairly involved discussion around that. I'd encourage you to look at the document and look at the current approach, and we can, if you want to raise issues, let's work through that. I have seen interest, you know, on the browser side. Yes, we have one browser who's interested in this primarily, but other folks are interested from other perspectives, especially people who want to do content negotiation and not touch the content.
Sure, I'm not denying. I mean, like lots of things would be convenient. Like it would be really convenient if like I sent you the content to my hard drive. That'd be really convenient for you too, right? I mean, that's not really the standard we're going to be applying here. Anyway, I think like as far as I know, there has been involved discussion about this, but my experience has been discussions with mostly people saying these aren't privacy issues when they obviously are.
Okay. Well, if you have privacy feedback, please give it. In terms of geolocation, my inclination is that we shouldn't be adding new things to this document, new axes of negotiation. But I do take Martin's point that if we have a broader scope of potential axes, that's going to be useful in forming this framework. Yo.
Yes. So regarding Eric's points, there is an opt-in. So this is not about sending users' private info or users' identifiable info to servers everywhere. The servers have to opt in, and clients can, for example, refuse to respect that opt-in or track if that opt-in also correlates with a vary header or a variance header, once that's a thing. And, you know, note that this server is asking for data that it's not using, and therefore it is suspicious and, for example, can go on some privacy list. This is generally the approach that we've taken, is that client hints should not expose information beyond what's already available in JavaScript. And if you see places where we've deviated from that goal, please let us know.
My objection is that there's a difference between active and passive fingerprinting, and that for you to say that the standard we're going to apply is that with permission we're going to have passive fingerprinting for anything which you could have gotten with JavaScript is like not an appropriate standard. And that's exactly what's wrong, by the way.
What I'm saying is that it's not 100% passive because there is an opt-in and you can track its usage. So if someone opts in and doesn't use that data for the intended purpose, then you could potentially mark it as, you know,
dramatically harder than there's the JavaScript to use this data.
Right, lastly, Google. I'm sorry, Ecker. If the user is opting into setting geolocation in the permission prompt, how is that passive?
Martin Thompson, I'll answer that because you give
the site permission once and that persists, now you have active use of that permission on every single request, as opposed to just at the point where the activation of the request was made. So the material difference here is that when the site asks for geolocation, it asks for geolocation and gets it. That's an action that can be tracked. But when you have this sort of capability, you have a one-off opt-in, and then you have geolocation being provided on every single request, even if the server only uses it on 2 of them or 1 of them.
But right now, the prompts also have an always.
Just remember, we don't have geolocation.
Okay, well, yeah,
so let's not discuss stuff that we're not actually
maybe
talking about.
I'm happy to talk this offline, and maybe I'll persuade you, and maybe I won't. Okay.
So I would say one of the takeaways here is we need to open a GitHub issue attached to client hints that covers this issue, and the working group will have to come to consensus on whether or not the security considerations can be, amended to satisfactorily deal with it, or whether the issue is, just overly fatal. I think for the moment, we should track this with, an issue to make sure consensus is reached. I thought there were no open issues in this draft, but we'll double check and make sure that's the state. Okay. When anyone else, we have time. If anyone else has a last comment here, or we can move on. Okay. So speaking of long-time drafts, we have RFC 6265-BIS, known as the cookies rewrite. And is Mike with us online? He was going to speak to progress, and some progress has happened since our last. We'll get together. Is Mike in the audience there in Meet.echo? We can't scroll, so we don't know. Mike West, are you there? All right, Mike does not appear to be online.
So I know Mike has made some updates to this document. His task is to integrate the resolution of the issues that we discussed, which is mostly things like errata, as well as the major document proposals that we accepted earlier on in this process. And I think he has integrated almost all of those. I'm not sure, but I think his intention is that he will have a document ready for working group last call in the near-ish future. So hopefully we'll either be talking about this with an eye towards working group last call in London, or before that with any luck. But we'll wait for Mike to give us an update on the list since he's not here. That's a good question, actually. We're going to need people to review that document once it's ready. Who's intending or willing to review the cookies draft once we have it in a good state? I see a smattering of hands. We need to increase that number. A very light smattering of hands.
So thank you, Jeff Hodges. Thank you, Mike Bishop. Would anyone else like to thank you by raising their hand? Go ahead, Martin.
Martin Thompson. We've been having a discussion internally about expiration times on cookies and how cookies are expired. And I'm wondering whether or not there's going to be another thing to add to the pile in a very short amount of time. What we're seeing, just to give a brief flavor of the problem, is that different browsers have different policies with respect to retention of cookies. And they have different limits on the number of cookies they'll accept, and the size of those cookies, and various other things. And we've recently increased our number to match that of Chrome's. But we had this whole priority discussion. It sort of plays into that. There's some really awful side effects when you start expiring cookies that aren't expired, and having some sort of common strategy across user agents would be kind of nice. So we've nothing yet at the moment. We have someone looking into it, but we may want to talk about that at some point.
Yeah, that definitely does lead to real world failures. Right? So.
Yeah, it's kind of awful, actually, the situation that we're in, because once you start expiring cookies in different browsers, all bets are off. You have no idea what you can rely on anymore. It's really kind of random, actually.
So when we discussed cookie priorities, my perception at the time was we were very close to adopting it, but we just didn't quite make the line. Are you saying that maybe we should reconsider that?
No, cookie priorities was not the solution that we've discussed, and it's probably better to, if we actually come up with a proposal and raise it here, rather than go back to that.
Okay, I sense you're not quite ready. Do you think we'll be seeing a draft soon, or just an email message? Or?
I think it's going to be in the form of an email message, okay. Because I don't want to write a draft until we have discussed the broad strokes of the problem. It's very early days. Okay. The thread started this week, in fact, so we'll see.
All right, we'll wait for that then. I don't think you're in danger of the cookie document shipping, in those kinds of time frames.
Yeah, I thought just fair warning on that one, that's all.
Thanks for that.
Okay, which brings us to BCP 56-BIS. It's inaugural appearance on our active draft agenda. Mark has the presentation here as author of this, right? He gets to stand up and stretch his legs.
At the end of the week, it's no longer a pink box, it's a pink angle. So it's kind of sad down there. So BCP 56 came about around, what was that, 2000-ish, 2001, somewhere in that time frame. And it embodied the best thinking about how to use HTTP as a substrate at the time. How people use HTTP has moved on considerably since then. And so we adopted, very recently now, this document. I think this is really important because now we have a large number of IETF working groups creating new protocols that use HTTP for some value of use. And I don't know how deep we want to go into this today. I really just want to get people to start to look at this document. I know that I have a lot more work to do on it. It's very sketchy and very bare bones now. And I think it needs a lot more examples and a lot more text explaining why things are the way they are. But I want people to start looking at the principles in the document to make sure we have good agreement on those principles. I don't know. Can you hear? So the first thing here in section 2 is, we need to decide when this document applies. And so at a high level, the approach that I took was, if you're using port 80 or 443, or you're using URLs with an HTTP-ish scheme, or if you identify the protocol as HTTP using one of our ALPN identifiers, or if you're using the message formats we describe along with the registries that kind of fill those up, you're using HTTP and this document applies. Does that make sense? Okay. Scroll on down. And then we go into the general, this is mostly advisory here in this section. I think you can scroll on down, just kind of getting people used to how we think about HTTP, how we think about links on the web, how you can, why you don't want to just use HTTP as an RPC, because, hopefully you're using HTTP to get some of the value out of it, rather than just tunnel through, firewalls, which I think is maybe another discussion for another venue as to whether that's good practice or not. That seems to be coming up a lot too. And then down in section 4 are the more specific recommendations. How you specify that you're using HTTP, what documents you refer to, stuff like that. Keep on scrolling. How you define HTTP resources. So, resources are one of the high-level concepts that we have in HTTP, and we're encouraging people to specify their use of HTTP in terms of resources. Keep on going. And then how to handle URLs, how to discover URLs, how we, we use, I don't think I actually use HateOS here because I'm trying not to talk about REST religion in this document, but There's a little peek of that in here in a couple of places. Talking about how to use URL schemes, when it's appropriate to create a new one, which is not terribly often. And how to choose a transport port. Methods, status codes. This is all fairly straightforward if you've been around HTTP for a while. Header fields, their definition, referring into the stuff we already wrote in 7231. And then there's some empty stuff here about payloads and interoperating with browsers, because that's one of the big benefits of using HTTP. And I think I want to talk about things like cores there. Access control, authentication, application state. And then the boilerplate after that. I don't think that, check to see if there are any appendices, I forget. Lots of references. So many references. Nope, okay. So that's kind of the high level approach to the document. As I said, I think it needs a lot of filling out. It is doubtless going to be a fair amount longer. If folks want to help out with that, that's great. But right now, I just want to make sure that to validate the kind of core principles that it's talking about. And I'd love any feedback now or on list or privately.
So one of the reasons I was interested in seeing this document adopted now is, there is contemporaneous work in IETF. JMAP for a couple iterations now. There's a group that could use a document like this to refer to, and as a check on how they design their thing. DOE, obviously, this time around. As a document editor in DOE, it's one of my objectives to move both of these things forward so that they're consistent with each other. And even less obvious things like, DKG had a proposal in dprive that was really would have fallen under the auspices of this document, under your definition of using HTTP, that would have qualified, right? And so I think it's interesting.
Actually, and yeah, you remind me, JMAP was especially interesting for me because, the initial kind of visceral reaction was, oh, what the hell are they doing to HTTP? And through discussions with them, it's very clear that they have very good reasons for the design that they're using. And it is not a traditional use of HTTP. They have requirements that are not practically met by HTTP today. And so that tells me that we need to make sure that it's clear that there are cases where, it's still okay to use HTTP, in perhaps non-traditional patterns, and there are reasons for that. But then you need to make an informed decision when you do that. And it also is interesting because it indicates to me there's opportunity for new HTTP extensions to meet those kinds of use cases in the future. So there still may be some interesting work to do. Yay.
So this is not the world's perhaps most exciting document, but I would like to put out a plea to the working group that, the amount of accumulated knowledge in the working group about these topics, is more amongst this set of practitioners than really any other set in the world. And so reading this, even sharing in terms of anecdote, where suggestions have worked and haven't worked in the past can highly inform this and make this a more practical document, perhaps than its predecessor. And that really is, at this point, the problem with what it's updating. So, I think Mark's signing up to do all that sort of the heavy lifting here, but if you can make sure you read it and just have even general commentary on what it's suggesting, I think that would be very helpful. And to be successful, that's, as the shepherd of this document, is what I need to hear is that diversity, I think, of viewpoints to make it work.
Xavier Marjou, is this document also intended as a kind of best practices for so-called REST APIs?
I don't think that's an explicit goal. I think people could use it as such in many ways, but that's a much larger task. And I think we need to assemble more of the components to be able to do that. I have another draft or two that kind of push us in that direction, but they're not for this working group. This is really, the target audience for this is IETF working groups and IETF efforts that want to use HTTP as a substrate protocol. Not necessarily the entire world. If the rest of the world gets some benefit out of it, that's great. But it's not an explicit goal.
Ted Hardy, Incipient Yeti. I did actually want to talk a little bit about the best practice aspect of this, because I think BCP 56 was put out with that status because the author mistakenly believed that it would serve as a gatekeeping role. I think we're all aware with the divergence between actual reality and BCP 56 that it did not serve as any realistic gatekeeping role. And in general, the IETF has moved away from the belief that controlling registries or making best current practices is an effective protocol stick for the wider development community. I would thoroughly agree with the need to deprecate BCP 56 as it currently exists as a result of the mismatch between its aims and how the document evolved, or how the ecosystem evolved. Both are true. But I might ask you to consider whether this would be better off as an informational or standards track document rather than a BCP if it also obsoleted BCP 56. Because I think that there are some places in which the exploration of what the options are does not require them to be best current practices to be useful exploration. And the document might get a bit broader and a bit more useful if you weren't trying to keep it to things that were BCP-ish.
That's a fair point. I think it's worth discussing.
Okay. It's nice to have a meeting where you don't have to just cut the mic lines. All right, that brings us into overtime. We've got one topic left to discuss. So Yoav and Vlad have updated the work they've been doing on HTTP2 cross-stream compression. Yoav, you can put yourself in the queue if you want. We'll get you if there's a speaker. This is work that has been presented in an earlier form in a full state at least once, and has been discussed more than one time. And the merit here is fairly obvious, especially as you talk about very small resources, and the trend is towards smaller resources, and many of us think that's actually a useful thing for web architecture. The ability to have compression apply cross-stream gives you substantially better compression ratio results, and the authors have shown that in past experiences. On the other hand, there is no there is no document author or working group chair or area director who wants to be the one that says, "Oh, compression and encryption, that's okay to put together this time." Right. So everyone remains very nervous about the prospect of that and the security analysis of that combination. So the chairs have actually sought out reviews outside of this working group since we last met from some experts in the field to do some analysis on the mitigations presented in this work and other similar work. And we have been unsuccessful so far in getting anyone to sign up to take on that work, maybe because they also don't want to be the person to say compression and encryption, it's okay this time. I'm not sure, they haven't given that as a reason, but I somewhat suspect that to be the case. So if you, gentle members of the working group, have contacts or suggestions of experts in the field that might be reasonable to reach out to, who've done this kind of web security work in the past, who would be, well regarded in their conclusions, we would love to have a conversation with them. That being said, Yoav has made some updates to the document and to their security considerations, and I think we should give it some airing to help further understand what we're talking about in the current state of the art is. Yoav?
Yes. So I ran and I don't want, I'm not a security person per se, but I ran some analysis of the various risks and potential mitigations. And that analysis is now part of the document, but I think the highlights there would be that mitigating attacks that are cross-origin is most probably simple because the client can simply say that there is no compression context sharing between different origins and be done with that. It won't hurt the use case all that much and will significantly increase our ability to protect users there. The part where mitigation is a bit less obvious is for same origin secret leaks. And it's very hard to actually protect against same origin secret leaks even today, because in most cases, an attacker page can fetch the secret content and examine it that way. But right now, an attacker can protect itself, like a page can protect itself against such an attack by including various by restricting across the origin, sending CSP headers that restrict the use of fetch, for example. So if that is indeed the case, then compression dictionary attack can reveal such secrets. But I've stated, like I've put together in the document a few ways that enable us to potentially mitigate against that. One of them is padding of transfer sizes in certain cases. Another is to limit this compression to non-credentialed fetches, which would, at least today, significantly restrict its benefits, but it's significantly better than nothing if this is the only way we can mitigate against that attack. And generally, I would love to get some more feedback on those attack vectors and mitigations and the overall security story from people who do that as their day job. And one more thing related to this space, I believe we have Loda from Google's compression team online who's been working on shared broccoli, which shares some of the aspects. Like, it can potentially, if you look at it the right way, address some of the same use cases while also addressing different use cases. So it's also something in this space.
With that being said, are there any comments in the general space? As I said, I think this is a problem that HTTP2 would like to solve, which is, we have not adopted this draft out of security concerns, but we keep talking about the topic because I think it is meaningful, and it is in a way, a meaningful criticism of HTTP2, so it's something we should continue to talk about. But Mark is telling me this is an HTTP, a version independent issue, and I would acknowledge that.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, I think Patrick basically summarized it right from the outset. Yeah, there are various things that we know that we can do, but there are also a large tract of things that we just have too much uncertainty over. And it's funny because to some extent, we have this problem within resources that intermix secrets and attacker-controlled information. But once you start crossing resource boundaries, now we're talking. It's a very different game at that point, and opening that potential up is somewhat worrying, particularly when things can be applied generically.
Ian Sweat, Google. I did have a question. If it sounds like there are two kind of mostly unrelated but potentially solutions in the same space. One is this draft that was written up here, and another one is this kind of custom Brotli dictionary or custom other dictionary approach. Do we have an idea of the relative compression efficiency of the two approaches compared to one another? Because I mean, I think it seems like it's easier to analyze the
publicly shared dictionary option than the cross-stream compression option. And so if they're similar from an overall performance perspective, I mean, the cross-stream one, it also has a negative from a quick perspective that it's like a huge pain in the ass, like monumental. So like, if we could push towards something that's a little tighter, that would be preferable for my.
I think that the question is not the compression efficiency, but the use cases they express. The use cases are slightly different. Shared dictionaries address the use case of relatively large websites who have a large amount of repeat visitors, and therefore can download the dictionary out of band and then advertise that among everyone, like with multiple visits from users. Where the compression context in H2 proposal is mostly addressing the bundling use case. So right now, people send many small files over H2, and these are significantly better compressed when bundled. At the same time, bundling is killing custom granularity. And it would be great if we could tell developers to stop bundling and rely on the transport to solve that problem for them. So the use cases are different. Shared dictionaries, like out-of-band shared dictionaries, can potentially give you better performance, but they have other that necessarily are not necessarily compatible with all use cases.
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, yeah, I've got basically what I was going to say. Vlad did some analysis on this and found that the opportunity cost of sending a large blob of shared dictionary ahead of all of these small things that we wanted to compress wasn't particularly good for performance when you didn't have some sort of prior loading for the dictionary. So there's something to keep in mind with all of this. The performance here is actually pretty amazing. The problem is balancing that out with other things. I don't think there's been any question about the performance benefits of this. It's just the safety.
And if you haven't read Vlad's previous analysis of the performance of it, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And persuasive, as far as that goes.
Yes.
There's also a third entrance in this that's been kicked around, and I'm not sure quite how public that is, but there's a growing set of interest in this problem, but none of them have security solutions that much different than what we're seeing in this draft.
Yeah, and part of the problem here is that we just don't know what's in responses. It's fundamentally the problem, and we don't know how to analyze them in such a way that we can actually make sense of it. There's someone in queue.
You might be muted. Your mouth is moving.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I am Lode from the compression team in Google Zurich, working on shared broadly. We are creating better dictionaries for broadly compression and looking into the shared dictionaries. And we also have made a draft of a specification available currently on github.com/google/broadly/fetch spec. And we are interested to collaborate with this effort.
Okay. Do you have opinions on the security consideration?
No strong opinions right now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And if you could send a message to the mailing list,
yeah,
excuse me, with that link in it. And if you want to consider it as a proposal, it's probably best to see it as an internet draft. You can do that. Thank you.
Yeah.
With that, unless anyone has any further topics on compression and encryption, I think we're wrapped up. Or any HTTP topic. I guess we have a few minutes for open mic. If you have anything to say.
So, Martin Thompson, just feedback on that last comment. The spec, that the proposal is, as written, a patch on the fetch spec. So think about that for a moment. Yeah, my little mind's blown. It's incomprehensible as a result. Anyone who's read fetch will understand that it's great for some things, but not great for others.
Going once, going twice. You're adjourned. Thank you.
See you all in London, hopefully.
Where's that blue sheet? Someone waved the blue sheet.
Somebody can search the room for the blue sheet. There
Yes.
it is. Yay. Give me a point. We're trying, man. We're trying. Yeah. We're sorry. We know we've disappointed you, but try and do better. So. I think we should just have a discussion. I mean, to me, if we're not going to get any browsers to implement it, then and if what I would like to understand is how much more likely it is about being put there than it is for Chrome, since we know how Patrick. Yeah. So I mean, are you okay with that if I drop off and we add?